Hi, the issue that I chose to talk about today during the reform movement was the women's suffrage movement. And the issue concerning this movement and why it started was that women did not have the right to vote, and women were basically just advocating for equal rights in this sense specifically. Who did the issue impact? It mostly just affected women, obviously, but it also impacted society as a whole and how they viewed women from this point on. Why did the issue exist? Women's lack of rights were mostly due to long-standing traditional gender roles that society saw, and basically that women were meant to be housewives, taking care of their children, cooking, cleaning. They were not deemed to have a voice outside of those walls and basically were assumed to not have an opinion in our democracy. The movement actually began and picked up pace after many activists who participated in anti-slavery reform movements saw the success of those and moved on to women's rights as well. What was attempted to solve the issue? To solve the issue, women had created a group called the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and they argued women should have the right to vote. They did protests. They participated during the First World War. They showed all their dedication to the country. And some other groups had used more dramatic tactics like pickets outside of the White House to gain importance. And those were just a few ways that they showed their support for their rights. And the long-lasting impact of the issue and the solution that followed: on August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. Women had gained the right to vote, and over 8 million women voted that year. And this opened doors for the future of equal rights for women, such as equal pay, birth control, opportunity to work, and basically just gave women a voice in our democracy. The essential question states, were progressive reformers successful in solving the issues that came about with the industrialization of America? And my claim was that the progressive reformers of the women's suffrage movement were successful in closing the gap between men's and women's rights because they gained the right to vote through faithfulness in the First World War. They proved their worth through speech and participation. They noted the hypocrisy of a democracy that violated the Constitution. And lastly, they reclaimed their gender roles as wives and mothers to further convince that their morality and domestic abilities would provide well for the country. My first source to support my claim is an excerpt of a newspaper. It is the Evening World, New York City, November 2nd, 1917. And the evidence that I took, it reads, "Think of President Wilson's words last week. Quote, 'This is the time to vote for women's suffrage.' Quote, 'He knew the need of women's power to organize for doing things, her spirit and capacity and vision. That was his message to New York.'" This is a primary source because the newspaper doesn't have an exact author, but the majority of this quote are actual words by President Wilson, and the entire paper was written during the time period and it was unedited from this time period. So the connection to my claim: this piece of evidence is connected because it shows the effect that women's outreach had on America as a whole. It worked to their advantage by them actually being able to vote eventually. Even the president during this time recognized that women were just as faithful and devoted to their country as men were during this First World War. And in this participation of patriotism, like my quote ties to, women were able to gain more respect and attention for their cause. My second source is a speech made by Susan B. Anthony after her arrest for casting an illegal vote in the election of 1872, and it reads, quote, "And it is a downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them, provided by this democratic Republican government, the ballot." And basically, how I know this is a primary source is it is a speech that came directly from Susan B. Anthony. She was one of the most prominent figures during this time of the suffrage movement, and it's a first-hand account from someone who experienced the prejudice, so that's what makes it a credible source. And her words and how they connect to my claim, it connects to the portion of my claim that talks about hypocrisy of inequality at the time and how it basically violated the Constitution, because about 100 years after the Constitution was created, the statement, "We the people," didn't legally represent all people of America, only white men. Susan B. Anthony recognized this in her push for the right to vote, and she basically pointed out that it's hypocritical to only allow women this right. My third source is an illustration created in 1917 by Nina Allender. It depicts the U.S. Representative Jeannette Rankin holding out her arms to embrace a young girl, who symbolizes the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, or basically just the right to vote, and two women watch on, criticizing and stating that child needs a woman to look after her. So how I know this is a primary source is because it is a real, unedited illustration created by someone who was living during this time period of reform, and we as readers know exactly who made it too. There's a signature on it. The connection to my claim: this drawing can be interpreted in two different ways, but the one that I think is correct is that it shows the women embracing for change. They're stating that the right to vote for women must be looked after by women themselves, or basically be advocated for by women. The amendment is represented as a child in this illustration, and I believe it shows that this amendment has not yet grown or reached full maturity, much like a child, considering it was not yet ratified. So Jeannette Rankin was a women's rights activist. She willingly opens her arms to change in this illustration. She scoops up the amendment to provide for it. These women standing together in support of the amendment refers directly to the part of my claim about participation and also reclaiming gender roles as mothers, as Jeannette is in this photo, to show a strong, caring side of themselves in favor of their rights. My fourth and final source that I used was a quote made by Henry Selden, who testified as a witness for the benefit of Susan B. Anthony while she was in court after her illegal voting. And it reads, "If the same act had been done by her brother under the same circumstances, the act would have been not only innocent, but honorable and laudable. But having been done by a woman, it is said to be a crime." End quote. So how I know that this is a primary source is because the words come directly from Henry Selden. They're important to the timeline of this event because it was literally during Susan B. Anthony's trial, and he was a witness to testify in court, so we know all of this to be true in the court of law. So the connection to my claim, this relates to the part about hypocrisy, because Henry Selden himself, a man in the position of power at the time, noted that he believed it was the first court case that occurred purely based on gender, and this just shows the discrimination and inequality of all of it. Susan B. Anthony's trial as a whole is a result of her brave actions to fight against unequal rights. It was kind of a catalyst for making even more change, and this quote points out the irony of the entire situation in that equality had to happen. The two sources that I chose for corroboration were my second and fourth sources, and the second one was the one out of the speech by Susan B. Anthony. The fourth one was the quote by Henry Selden while representing her in court in her trial. So not only is that a similarity that he was representing her, or possibly it's just a coincidence, but the main similarity and why I chose these two sources is that they both talk about the hypocrisy and the mockery that is occurring in the democracy, and basically just the overall contradiction of the Constitution. So another similarity I found is that both Susan B. Anthony and Henry Selden were advocating for women's rights, not against them, and that's pretty important to note in this situation. They shared a common perspective, and like I said, Henry spoke in court for Susan. So one difference I did note, and it was mostly the largest one in these two quotes, is that Susan focuses more on the constitutional and legal matter of inequality, while Selden focused more on the moral and social construct of voting in men and women and how common people would react to quote-unquote such a crime. So they both took slightly different ways of going about the issue of hypocrisy within our unequal rights. Lastly, the source that I found to be most reliable out of the four was Susan B. Anthony's speech, which was the second source. I believe it's the most reliable because she was one of the biggest leaders of the suffrage reform movement at the time in leading it to success, and therefore it has the most historical value, and credibility to the claim. And also, I talked often about her brave decision to go and illegally vote, which was a catalyst and an example made during this reform as to how women can, in the future, gain the right to vote.